The first time Sallie Ramsey heard the name Thomas Dawson, she was standing in a general store in Abilene, Kansas, in the summer of 1873, and every single person inside that store had gone so quiet you could hear the dust settling on the floorboards. She had only just arrived in town, her traveling trunk still strapped to the back of a rented wagon, her hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed bonnet that had seen better days and a dress that had seen better weeks. She had come from Missouri, from a small farm outside of Hannibal, where the soil had given up the fight 2 seasons back, and her father's debts had finally swallowed what little the drought had left behind. She was 24 years old, she had $42 sewn into the lining of her petticoat, and she had a letter from a man named Gerald Holt who ran a boarding house on the main street of Abilene and needed someone to manage his books and keep the place from falling into chaos. It was not the life she had imagined. But Sallie Ramsey had long since made her peace with the gap between what she had imagined and what actually was. She had been asking the storekeeper, a round-faced man named Mr. Pratt, about the best way to get her trunk moved to the boarding house, when the door to the shop opened, and a boy of maybe 12 came running in with his boots slapping the wooden floor and his eyes wide as wagon wheels. "Thomas Dawson's back," the boy said, breathless, and those 3 words did something remarkable to the room. Mr. Pratt stopped mid-sentence. The woman at the fabric counter who had been holding a bolt of calico froze with it halfway unwound. A man near the back who had been examining a harness set it down very carefully and turned to face the door as though expecting something to come through it. A young couple near the window exchanged a look that said nothing good. Sallie looked around at all of them and felt a peculiar mixture of curiosity and amusement rising in her chest. "Who is Thomas Dawson?" she asked, and her voice was the only sound in the room. Mr. Pratt looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has just asked why the sky is blue, only the answer is complicated and dangerous. "He is," Mr. Pratt began, then stopped. "He is Thomas Dawson," he finally said, as though that explained everything. "That tells me very little," Sallie said pleasantly. The woman at the fabric counter leaned in slightly. "He killed 3 men in Dodge City," she whispered. "Supposedly 4, the man near the back said. "The 4th one did not die," the woman corrected, and they spoke about it as casually as other people discussed the weather, which told Sallie a great deal about the kind of town Abilene was in 1873. She had read about men like Thomas Dawson, or men she supposed were like him. The cattle drives had been flooding the Kansas cow towns for years, bringing with them a particular kind of lawlessness that the newspapers back east described in breathless terms, and that the people who actually lived through it described in much simpler ones. Men who had come back from the war with nothing, and found that nothing had a shape to it out here, a freedom that could cut both ways. Gunfighters. That was the word people used. Some of them were hired by the cattle outfits to protect their herds on the long drives up from Texas. Some of them were hired by town marshals to help keep order. Some of them just existed somewhere between those 2 things, which was the most dangerous place of all. She filed the name Thomas Dawson away in the back of her mind and went back to asking Mr. Pratt about her trunk. She did not think about him again for 2 days. Those 2 days were full enough. Gerald Holt turned out to be a decent man in his 60s with a bad hip and a worse head for numbers. And the boarding house, which was called simply Holt's, was a solid 2-story structure with 8 rooms, a dining room that served meals to boarders and a handful of paying outsiders, and a kitchen run by a woman named Berta who was German and formidable, and who informed Sallie on the first morning that she would handle the kitchen and Sallie would handle everything else, and they would get along fine as long as Sallie never suggested changing the recipe for the bread. Sallie agreed immediately. She liked Berta. The work suited her. She was good with numbers, good at keeping track of things, good at the kind of quiet management that made a place run smoothly without anyone noticing it was being managed at all. She learned the names of the current boarders within the first afternoon. She sorted out a billing confusion that had been sitting unresolved for 3 months. She reorganized the supply ledger and found two places where they had been overpaying for flour and lamp oil. Gerald Holt looked at what she had accomplished by the end of the second day and said, with great feeling, "Miss Ramsey, I believe you may have saved my life." She laughed at that genuinely, and it felt good to laugh. The last few months in Missouri had not had much room for it. On the evening of that second day, Sallie walked down the main street of Abilene because she needed air, and because she was the kind of person who learned a place by walking through it. The town was busy in the particular way of cow towns in summer. The cattle season was at its height, and the Texas drovers who had made the long journey up the Kishom Trail were spending their wages with the dedicated enthusiasm of men who had gone without for months. The saloons were doing excellent business. The hotels and boarding houses were full. The street had a particular quality of barely contained energy, like a fire that was burning hot but not yet out of control. She walked past the hardware store and the land office and the post office and the two competing hotels, noting the businesses and their relationships to one another with the instinctive eye of someone who thought in terms of accounts and flows and balances. She paused at the window of a millinery that had a remarkably ugly hat displayed at the front, considered it for a moment, and moved on. She was nearly back to Holt's when she heard it. Not shouting, not a gunshot. Just a sudden, total collective silence coming from the direction of the largest saloon on the street, a place called the Silver Spur. It was the same silence she had heard 2 days ago in Mr. Pratt's store, the same quality of held breath, of a room turning itself toward a single point of attention. And then, cutting through it, a voice, low and even and carrying in the way that voices carry when they do not need to be raised to be heard. "I said I want the bottle. Leave the glass." There was a pause, and then the unmistakable sound of a bottle being set on a bar. Sallie stood on the boardwalk outside the Silver Spur and told herself she was going back to the boarding house. She had accounting to finish. She had a supply order to draft. She was a sensible woman with sensible priorities. She pushed open the door of the Silver Spur and walked inside. The room was not empty. There were perhaps 20 men in it and a handful of women in the bright dresses that Sallie knew by now meant they worked there. But every single one of them had arranged themselves in a rough crescent shape that left a clear space at the bar. And in that space stood a man with his back to the room, his right hand resting loosely on the bar beside a bottle of whiskey. He was tall and rangy in the way of men who had spent years in the saddle, broad through the shoulders but lean through the waist, wearing a dark coat that had been good once and trailed dust on his boots and a hat pulled low. He had dark hair that was a little long past the collar, and there was a quality about the set of his back, the way he stood, that communicated something wordlessly. Not aggression, not threat, something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. He had a gun on his hip. But so did half the men in the room, and none of them were commanding the same wide berth. Sallie walked to the bar and pulled up a chair, not to the stool beside him. There was no stool beside him because all the stools had been subtly abandoned. She pulled up one of the chairs from the nearest empty table, carried it to the bar about 3 feet from where the man was standing, sat down in it with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had every right to be there, and said to the bartender, "I will have whatever you have that is cold and not alcoholic. Lemonade if you have it, water if you do not." The silence in the room shifted quality, from a held breath to something more like bewilderment. The man at the bar turned his head. His face was, she thought, the kind that would have been handsome if it had ever been at rest. Strong jaw, dark eyes, a scar through one eyebrow that she would later learn had come from a fence wire and not from anything dramatic. He looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he cannot quite classify, something that does not fit the expected categories. "You are sitting very close to me," he said. There was nowhere else to sit, she said, which was not entirely true but not entirely false either, and then she looked at the bartender, who was staring at her with an expression she could only describe as existential alarm. "Lemonade or water," she reminded him gently. The bartender, apparently deciding that the rules of hospitality outweighed the rules of self-preservation, began pouring water into a glass. The man at the bar was still looking at her. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "Thomas Dawson," she said. "I have been told you killed 3 men in Dodge City, though someone else said it was 4 and there seems to be ongoing disagreement about the 4th. Something moved across his face. It was gone very quickly, but she caught it. Something that might, in a better light, have been amusement. "The 4th one lived," he said, which was what the woman in the general store had said, and it had a quality of correction rather than pride. "Then the count stands at 3, she said, accepting her glass of water from the bartender, who was now watching them both with the focused attention of a man witnessing something unprecedented. "That does not bother you," Thomas said. It was not a question. "I am from Missouri," she said, which was not a full answer but felt like one. "My name is Sallie Ramsey. I manage the accounts at Holt's boarding house. I'm not here to give you trouble or take any either, Mr. Dawson. I simply wanted to sit down, and I was not aware the bar had a reservation policy." The corner of his mouth moved, just the corner, just for a second. "Thomas," he said, "nobody calls me Mr. Dawson." "All right," she said. "Thomas." She drank her water. He drank his whiskey. Around them, the room very slowly began to return to something resembling normal, conversation starting back up in careful undertones, a card game resuming at the table nearest the window, the bartender moving about with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has witnessed a natural phenomenon he cannot explain. After a long and not uncomfortable silence, Thomas said, "You are not afraid of me." "Should I be?" she asked. He thought about this in the serious way of a man who takes questions seriously. "Most people are," he said finally. "Most people," she said, "have not spent 3 years watching a farm die and an entire county's worth of men and women lose everything they had and still get up the next morning and try again. After that, I find that most things men do to look frightening are somewhat less frightening than advertised." He looked at her for a long moment. "We're in Missouri," he said. "Outside Hannibal, you know it." "I passed through once," he said, "going north, long time ago." They talked for another 20 minutes. Not about anything large or important. About the town and the cattle season, and whether the summer heat was worse here than it was in Missouri. He was not a man who talked easily, she could see that. Every sentence arrived as though it had been considered first, but he was also not a man who talked insincerely, which she found she valued more than ease. When she stood to leave, she said, "I hope your whiskey is satisfactory." "Better than the company I usually keep in this town," he said. She smiled at that, and she thought she saw him watch her go, though she did not turn around to confirm it. She walked back to Holt's in the warm Abilene evening and thought about dark eyes that were not unkind, and a voice that was low and even and carried without effort, and told herself firmly that she had come to Abilene to work and not to find trouble. She had been telling herself things like that her entire life, and it had never once worked. Thomas Dawson had come to Abilene for a specific and temporary purpose. He had been hired by a cattle outfit out of Texas, the Barlow operation, to ride north with a herd of 1,200 longhorns and see them safely delivered to the buyers who were waiting in Abilene. He had done this before for other outfits, because it was work he was good at, and because it paid better than most things he was qualified for, and because the long days on the trail had a quality of simplicity that he found easier than most alternatives. He was 28 years old. He had grown up in Tennessee, the second son of a farming family that had been shattered by the war and not put back together after it. He had gone west at 17 with nothing, and had been many things since then, some of which he was not proud of, and some of which he was, and the reputation that preceded him into rooms like the Silver Spur had been built over 10 years of hard living and harder choices in places like Dodge City and Wichita and Caldwell, and a dozen trail camps between Texas and Kansas. He had not set out to become someone whose name cleared rooms. It had happened incrementally, the way most things happened, and by the time he understood what he had become, it was too late to become something else without knowing what the something else might be. He thought about the woman at the bar for 2 days afterward. Not with longing, exactly. More with the particular attention of a man who has encountered something unexpected and is still working out what it means. She had sat down. Everyone else for years had stood up and moved away, and she had sat down, and she had not been pretending not to be afraid, and she had not been showing off. She had simply been comfortable. He found that he could not quite stop turning that over in his mind. On the third morning after the Silver Spur, he went to Holt's boarding house for breakfast. He told himself it was because Berta's reputation for cooking had reached even the drovers making camp outside town. This was true, but it was not the whole truth, and he was honest enough with himself, alone, to know the difference. The dining room at Holt's had 6 tables. 5 of them were occupied when he arrived. The 6th was the only one with an unobstructed view of the small desk in the corner near the window where Sallie Ramsey was sitting with an account book open, and a pencil behind her ear and a cup of coffee at her elbow. Her head bent over figures with the concentrated air of a woman solving a problem that matters. She looked up when he came in. Her expression said she had not expected him, which was honest, and then it said she was not displeased, which was more interesting. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He looked at the tables. "Is there a seat?" "Take whichever you like," she said, and went back to her numbers. He took the table closest to her desk. Berta came out of the kitchen and sized him up with the directness of a woman who had been cooking for strangers long enough to form reliable opinions quickly. She brought him coffee without being asked and told him there were eggs and salt pork and biscuits, and that if he wanted something different he had come to the wrong place. "That is fine," he said. He thought she approved of the answer. He ate. Around him the other boarders ate and talked among themselves, and he was aware of the awareness of him in the room, the careful way people angled away, the conversations that stayed quiet. He was used to it. He had been used to it for years in the same way a man gets used to a thing that is inconvenient but permanent. From the desk in the corner, Sallie Ramsey said, without looking up from her account book, "You are making everyone nervous." "I know," he said. "Does that bother you?" He considered this. "Not the way it used to." She looked up at that, her pencil pausing over the page. There was something in her look that was not pity and was not judgment, and was harder to name than either. Understanding, maybe, the kind that comes from experience rather than assumption. "That seems like something worth thinking about," she said. "I think about it," he said. She nodded as though that were the right answer and went back to her book. He finished his eggs and his salt pork and 3 of Berta's biscuits, which were remarkable, and drank 2 cups of coffee. When he left, he put the money on the table and added more than was asked, because he could see from the dining room that the roof wanted patching in the back corner, and the whole place was running lean in the way of a business that was almost but not quite making what it needed to. He did not know why he noticed that. He noticed it, though. He came back for breakfast the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 4th morning, there was a problem. One of the other boarders, a young drover named Calhoun who had more confidence than sense and had been drinking since the night before, came in loud and careless and full of the bristling energy of a young man looking to make an impression somewhere. He sat down at the table nearest the window, and when Berta came out, he spoke to her in a way that was disrespectful enough to make the other boarders at their tables go very quiet. Sallie came out from behind her desk with the same calm purposefulness she seemed to bring to everything, and she said, pleasantly but with a quality of certainty underneath it that left no room for argument, "That is not how we speak to people in this establishment, Mr. Calhoun. You will apologize to Mrs. Berta, and you will conduct yourself appropriately, or you will find your room has become available to someone else." Calhoun was young and drunk enough to take this badly. He stood up, which was a mistake, and he started to say something that would have been a bigger one. Thomas Dawson, who had been sitting at his usual table eating his 3rd biscuit, set down the biscuit, put his coffee cup to one side, and turned in his chair to look at Calhoun with the specific quality of attention that he had developed over 10 years and that communicated something beyond words, something about the arrangement of a man in space and the distance between a decision and its consequences. Calhoun looked at him. He sat back down. He apologized to Berta. It was not a particularly gracious apology, but it was an apology, which was sufficient. Berta received it with the dignity of a woman who found the whole episode mildly beneath her notice and went back to her kitchen. Sallie looked at Thomas Dawson with an expression he found he wanted to earn again, something composed of assessment and quiet warmth. "Thank you," she said. "He will be fine tomorrow," Thomas said. "He is young." "You are not so very much older," she said. "I feel considerably older," he said. She tilted her head. "So do I," she said, and there was something in that which was not complaint, just recognition. The particular kinship of people who have covered more ground than their years exactly account for. After that, the mornings at Holt's became a kind of fixture. He came every day. He ate his breakfast at his usual table, and he and Sallie talked, not always for long. Not always about anything that mattered on the surface. But there was a quality to it that he did not remember experiencing before, a sense of being spoken to directly, without the careful navigation around his reputation that everyone else performed. She told him about Missouri, about the farm and the drought and the slow, terrible process of watching something you love die by increments. She told him about her father, who had been a stubborn man and a proud one, and who had refused to believe the land was finished until it was far too late to do anything practical about it. She said this without bitterness, or at least without the kind of bitterness that has not been worked through, and he understood from this that she had done the work of understanding her own history without asking it to be other than it was. He told her, in return, things he did not generally tell people. Not about the men he had killed, which was not something he found easy to discuss, and which she did not press him on, but about Tennessee, about the farm there, about his older brother who had come back from the war changed in ways that were not visible from the outside, but that the family had had to learn to navigate around like rocks in a river. About going west at 17 with the specific combination of grief and determination and naivety that he now recognized as the exclusive province of very young men who have not yet learned how much they do not know. "Why did you stay?" she asked one morning. "Out here, I mean. You could have gone back." "There was nothing to go back to," he said. "And then it had been long enough that out here was the thing I knew. It is harder than people think to undo knowing." She looked at him over her coffee cup. The morning light was coming in through the window of the dining room, and it was the kind of light that makes everything look like something worth keeping. "I think," she said carefully, "that knowing something different is possible is the first part. The second part is finding a reason that makes the difference worth the cost of it." He thought about that for a long time after he left. The Barlow cattle had been delivered by the middle of July, and the outfit's business in Abilene was technically concluded, which meant that Thomas had been paid and was free to go. He could have ridden south toward Dodge or west toward Colorado or anywhere else. He was not a man with fixed obligations pulling him in any direction. He stayed in Abilene. He told himself this was because the summer was too hot for hard riding, and because his horse had thrown a shoe that the blacksmith had replaced badly, and he wanted to give the leg time to settle before pushing hard miles into it. These things were true. They were not the whole truth. He came to breakfast every morning, and on Tuesday and Thursday evenings he came to dinner as well, which Holtz offered to paying outsiders. And after dinner, he would sometimes sit on the front porch with Gerald Holt, who was a man who appreciated quiet company. And on a few evenings Sallie sat there too, with her mending or her account books. And the three of them would sit in the cooling evening air and watch the town wind down and talk about nothing and everything with the ease of people who have begun to form something like a household without having named it that. On the third Thursday evening of July, after Gerald had gone inside for the night, Sallie and Thomas sat on the porch alone for the first time. The evening was purple and warm and smelled of dust and horses, and the faint sweetness of something blooming somewhere that Sallie could not identify. The street had gone quieter. Somewhere down the block a piano was playing in the silver spur, the same 3 chords cycling around. "Can I ask you something?" Sallie said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "I may not answer. Why are you still here?" He was quiet for a moment in the way she had come to learn meant he was actually thinking rather than avoiding. "You asked me that before," he said. "About why I stayed out west. This time I am asking specifically about Abilene," she said. "The Barlow job is done. You have been paid. You have no reason to stay." "That I have told you about," he said. She looked at him. The lamp by the porch door was lit, and it made the angles of his face softer than the daylight did. She thought again that he had a face that would be at rest if it ever allowed itself to be, and that the reason it did not allow itself to be was probably something she could understand more of if he let her. "Sallie," he said, and the way he said her name, with the particular attention of a man who does not use names carelessly, made something tighten in her chest that she had been carefully not acknowledging for several weeks. "I'm not very good at this." "At what?" she said. "At saying things plainly that are not about horses or cattle or the best road between 2 points." "You have been saying things plainly to me every morning for a month," she said. "Not this kind of thing," he said. She waited. The piano cycled through its 3 chords. An owl called somewhere in the dark beyond the end of the street. "I think," he said, slowly and with great care, "that you are the most honest person I have met in longer than I can remember, and that sitting across from you in the morning with coffee and eggs is the best part of my day, and that I do not want to stop doing that. And I do not know what to do with that because I am not sure that I have anything to offer a woman like you except a reputation that is not what you deserve to be associated with, and a set of skills that are mostly applicable to things that happen outdoors and sometimes involve shooting." Sallie was quiet for a moment. "Thomas," she said. "Yes. That is one of the most honest things anyone has ever said to me." He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was open in a way she had not seen before, something careful and rare and worth protecting. "I mean it," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That is what makes it worth hearing." She paused. "I think perhaps you have more to offer than you have been given reason to believe, and I think perhaps my judgment on what I deserve to be associated with is mine to make." He looked at the street for a moment and then back at her. "Would you walk with me tomorrow evening?" he said. "Just a walk, no saloons." She smiled, and she could feel it in her face, the kind of smile that does not worry about being seen. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." They walked the following evening, and the evening after that, and by the end of July they were walking every evening that the weather allowed, which in Kansas in summer was most of them. They walked the length of the main street and back, or out to the edge of town where the trail camps started, and the grass was long and the sky opened up in all directions. He was careful with her in the way of a man who is not sure of the terrain, but is determined to navigate it correctly, which meant he did not rush things, and he did not pretend to certainties he did not have. She appreciated this more than she could easily articulate. She had known men who were confident about everything, who moved toward what they wanted with the blunt directness of cattle going toward water, and she had never quite trusted the confidence because it did not seem to leave room for her. Thomas left room. He asked her things and waited for the answers, and listened when she gave them, actually listened, in the way that made it clear he was storing what she said and thinking about it, and letting it change his understanding of her in real time. She told him about her mother, who had died when Sallie was 12 of a fever that would not have killed her if they had been able to afford the doctor sooner. She told him about the years after that, keeping the farm with her father, learning to do more than girls in that county were generally expected to do, because necessity is a better teacher than convention. She told him she had taught herself accounting from the books her father had left lying around, the records of all the money that was not there, and that she had found something in the logic of it that was satisfying in the way that anything is satisfying when it is the thing you are built for. He told her, on one of those evenings when the sky was going amber and the wind was coming up from the south smelling of heat and grass, about the year He had spent working for a man named Rance Calloway in New Mexico, who had used his skills with a gun to enforce a land grab that Thomas had not fully understood the shape of until he was already inside it. One of the many instances in those years when powerful men used the instability of the territory to push out the people who had been there before them. Apache families, Hispanic families, communities that had been on that land for generations. He had quit when he understood what he was participating in, but he had participated first, and that was the part that sat badly. "I cannot undo it," he said. "I know I cannot, but it is there." She walked beside him and thought about what to say. "No," she said. "You cannot undo it, but you understood it and you stopped and you are carrying it, which is what people who take things seriously do. You did not excuse yourself." "That is a more charitable reading than I generally give it," he said. "I know," she said, "but I have thought about you for long enough now to have an opinion about the kind of man you actually are, and I think my opinion counts for something." He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked up at him in the gold light of the Kansas evening, and he was looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch slightly. "Sallie," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. It was brief and careful and asked more than it assumed, and when he pulled back he was looking at her with a question in his face, and she answered it by staying exactly where she was and not stepping back. "All right," she said softly. "All right," he said, and something in him seemed to settle, like a thing that has been braced against weight it expected to keep carrying, and has discovered the weight is not coming. They walked home in the warm dark, and everything was the same and nothing was the same. August came in hot and merciless the way Kansas Augusts do, and with it came a complication. His name was Calvin Reese, and he was a man Thomas had known in his Dodge City years, a gambler and a bully of the particular type who survives by attaching himself to men with harder edges and harder reputations. Reese had come to Abilene with a cattle buyer's outfit as a card dealer, which was the most respectable cover his skill set allowed. And when he found Thomas Dawson drinking coffee on the porch of a boarding house in the mornings and walking a woman through town in the evenings, he found it funny in the way that people find funny the things they do not understand. He made a comment about it at the Silver Spur one night when Thomas was present, a remark aimed at the room rather than at Thomas directly, the way cowardly men make their remarks, something about domestication and the waste of a good reputation. Thomas looked at him for a moment and said, "You should be more careful about what you think is funny," and then went back to his drink, and that should have been the end of it. But Reese was the kind of man who could not let things go, partly because he was drunk and partly because his personality had a structural deficiency in the area of recognizing good sense. And 2 days later, he came to Holt's boarding house in the middle of the morning on a pretended errand about finding a room, and used the opportunity to speak to Sallie at the front desk in a way that was designed to demean, to remind her, in terms she could not quite object to directly without seeming to react too strongly, that she was a woman alone in a rough town, and that the man she was spending her evenings with was known for things that were not the evenings. Sallie looked at him across the desk with the steady brown gaze that Thomas had come to think of as her most dangerous expression, the one that meant she was thinking clearly and was not afraid and was about to be precise. "I am afraid we do not have any rooms available," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Reese." He left. But the encounter sat badly with her, not because of what he had said, but because it had made real something she had been keeping theoretical. She had known, intellectually, that Thomas's reputation attached itself to the people around him. She had known, in the abstract, that there would be people who would make judgments about her based on it. Knowing it and having it walk through the door of the boarding house with a particular kind of smile were different things. She thought about it for 2 days and did not say anything to Thomas because she needed to work it through herself first. On the 3rd day she told him about it. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, the evening quiet around them, and she told him plainly what had happened and what the man had implied and how she had responded. Thomas's jaw went tight in a way she had not seen before. "I will deal with it," he said. "You will do no such thing," she said firmly. "He is not worth your trouble, and dealing with it in the way you mean will only give him what he wants, which is to matter. He does not matter. I told you because I believe we should tell each other things, not because I need you to fix it." He was quiet for a moment. "It is my fault," he said. "My past follows me like a shadow, and it touches everything around me." "Thomas," she said, "look at me." He did. "I walked into a room that everyone else was leaving when I first saw you. I did that because I decided to. This is no different. I know what your history is. I am choosing where I stand. That is my right." "You deserve better than having to choose against things," he said. "Everyone chooses against things," she said. "The question is whether what you are choosing for is worth it." She paused. "You are worth it. In case you were unclear about that." The expression on his face was something she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the look of a man who has been given something he was not sure he was allowed to have, and is very carefully beginning to believe that he is allowed. He reached across the small space between their porch chairs and took her hand, and she let him. And they sat like that in the evening with the town going quiet around them, until the lamp needed trimming and Gerald came to the door to say good night. Calvin Reese's departure from Abilene was ultimately managed not by Thomas, but by Marshal Tom Smith, who had been watching Reese's behavior with the card tables, and arrived at conclusions that had nothing to do with Sallie Ramsey and everything to do with a loaded deck found in Reese's room. He was escorted to the edge of town with a strong suggestion not to return, and that was the end of it. Thomas heard about this and came to tell Sallie, and she received the news with calm satisfaction and said, "Good. Berta's bread has risen better these past 2 days, and I believe the atmosphere of the house is improved." He laughed. She had heard him laugh before in smaller ways, but this was full and surprised and genuine, and it was, she thought, the best sound she had heard in a very long time. September arrived, and with it a letter from a Mr. Patterson of the Patterson Cattle Company in San Antonio, offering Thomas a contract for a fall drive that would bring a herd of 800 head up from Texas to the buyers in Abilene by October. It was good money, more than he had made on the Barlow job, and the Patterson outfit had a sound reputation. He came to Sallie with the letter in his hand and laid it on the desk in front of her and did not say anything. She read it. She read it again. She was quiet for a moment, turning over the specific weight of it, what it meant and what it was asking, not of him but of both of them. "When would you leave?" she asked. "Inside of a week," he said, "if I take it." "It is good money," she said. "It is," he said. "Is that why you are showing it to me?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I am showing it to you," he said carefully, "because I want to know what you think, and because whatever I decide, I want you to know I am deciding with that in mind." He paused. "With you in mind." She looked up from the letter. "Thomas, what are you telling me?" He looked at her across the desk with the direct honesty that was the thing she had come to love most about him. The thing she had known was there from the first evening in the Silver Spur when he had told her the fourth man had lived, correcting the record not because it mattered to his safety, but because accuracy mattered to him. "I am telling you," he said, "that I do not want to be the kind of man who rides away without having the conversation that ought to be had. I want to come back to Abilene when the drive is done. I want to come back to you if you will have me. And if you want me to stay now, I will send a letter to Patterson and tell him he needs a different man for his cattle." The room was quiet. Berta was in the kitchen, and the sounds of the kitchen were domestic and warm and real, the thump of bread dough and the clink of an iron pot. "I do not want you to give up work that is yours," Sallie said, "and I do not think I want to be the reason you give up things that are yours, but I want you to come back." She held his gaze. "I want you to come back, Thomas." "I will come back," he said. "I will hold you to that," she said. "I know you will," he said, and the way he said it made clear that this was exactly what he wanted. He left on a Tuesday, and she stood at the edge of the main street and watched him ride south toward the trail with the particular quality of watching that is not sadness exactly, but is adjacent to it, the recognition of the space a person leaves. She went back to her desk and her account books and her carefully ordered world, and she told herself she was fine. And she mostly was. And on the days when she was less fine, she talked to Berta, who had a Bavarian directness about matters of the heart that was simultaneously brutal and clarifying. "We'll come back," Berta said on one of those days, kneading bread with the steady authority of a woman who has lived enough to know the difference between the things that last and the things that do not. "That one, he is serious. I can see from a man who is serious." "How?" Sallie asked. "He eats the breakfast slowly," Berta said, which Sallie found initially baffling and then, after a moment of thought, completely understood. October came with its cooling air and its big open Kansas sky going blue and gold. The days grew shorter. The cattle season began to wind down. The Silver Spur was less busy, and the main street had a quieter quality that Sallie found she liked, the town showing more of its actual self without the summer crowds. Gerald's hip was worse, and she took on more of the physical management of the house alongside the accounts, learning from Berta which suppliers were reliable and which were not, learning the particular rhythms of the building, which door sticks in humid weather, which window lets in a draft from the north. She found she had come to love the place in the way you love a thing that has become part of your daily texture, not dramatically but deeply, the way you love the view from a window you have looked out of every morning. She was on the porch one afternoon in the third week of October, mending a tablecloth and thinking about nothing in particular when she heard it. Not the specific sound she was hoping for, but the general category of it: horses coming down the main street from the south, the trailing sounds of a cattle drive arriving, the distant low of tired longhorns, and the calls of drovers doing the final push. She set down the tablecloth. She stood up. She looked south down the main street, with the particular attentiveness of someone pretending to be casual. He came in with the herd's outriders, managing something with the buyer's men, and he was trail dusty and lean and exactly the same, only somehow more solid to her eyes now, the way a thing gains weight when you have been aware of its absence. He looked up as he rode past Holtz and he saw her on the porch, and he raised one hand from the reins in acknowledgement, and she raised her hand back. And that was all, because he had work to finish and she had dignity to maintain. But the warmth that moved through her was enough to fill an entire afternoon. He came to dinner that evening, washed and in clean clothes, and he ate Berta's pot roast with the focused appreciation of a man who has spent 6 weeks eating trail food. And after dinner, he and Sallie sat on the porch and she told him what had happened in Abilene while he was gone, and he told her about the drive. The storms they had weathered south of the river and the river crossing that had cost them 40 head, and the way the flat Texas land went on so long you start to believe there is nothing beyond it. "Were you glad to get back?" she asked. "To Abilene," he said. "I was glad to get back to you. Abilene is just where you are." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." "Do you want to keep doing drives?" she asked. It was not a challenge. It was a real question asked with the genuine interest of someone who wants to understand. He was quiet in that way of his, thinking rather than avoiding. "No," he said finally. "I think I am done with drives. I have been thinking about it on this one." He paused. "There is land north of town, couple of miles, good grassland, creek running through it. I went and looked at it before I left. It is available. The land office has the particulars." She looked at him. "Land," she said. "I have money saved," he said. "Not a great deal, enough to start if I am careful, a small operation, cattle, maybe some horses. It would not be large to begin with." "You have been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since about the third morning I had breakfast here," he said. She laughed softly. "That soon?" "I'm a practical man," he said. "When I know a thing, I know it." She looked out at the evening street, at the lamplit windows and the familiar silhouette of the town she had come to, not as a destination but as a way station, and had somehow made into something more. "I like this town," she said. "I have liked it more than I expected." "Would you stay?" he asked. She looked at him and understood that they were no longer talking about land. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "I am trying to," he said. "I am not very good at it." "You are doing better than you think," she said. He took a breath. "Sallie Ramsey," he said, "I have been trying to deserve the time you have given me since September, and I am not sure I have managed it, but I intend to keep trying for as long as you will let me. I would like to marry you if you will have me. I would like to build something that lasts with you on that land north of town. I know what I am bringing into it. I know my name is not uncomplicated, but I am asking anyway because you have taught me that asking plainly is the right approach." The evening air was cool, and the lamp by the door was warm, and Sallie looked at the man across from her. This complicated, careful, honest man who had walked through the world for 10 years, carrying more than he should have had to, and who had sat down across from her every morning and talked to her like a person and meant every word of it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." He reached across and took both her hands in his, and she felt the particular texture of his hands, work-hardened and warm, and she thought that this was one of those moments that people carry with them the rest of their lives, not the dramatic ones but the true ones, the ones where the thing that is going to be your life announces itself quietly. They were married in Abilene on a Saturday in November of 1873, in the small Presbyterian church on the north side of the main street. The ceremony was performed by the minister, Reverend Alcott, who had a kind face and a tendency to speak at length, but who mercifully kept the ceremony to a reasonable duration, because the November wind was coming through the church's inadequately caulked windows with considerable enthusiasm. Gerald Holt was there, leaning on his cane, with an expression of uncomplicated happiness that made Sally's eyes sting. Berta was there in her best dress, which was dark blue and very serious. Several of the boarding house's current long-term residents attended, and Mr. Pratt from the general store came and sat in the back and shook Thomas's hand afterward with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had expected things to go differently. There were a few others from town, people Sallie had come to know in her months at Holt's, women she had done business with, men who had eaten at the dining room table. Not a large gathering, but real, which she valued more than large. Thomas stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the aisle on Gerald Holt's arm, and the expression on his face was one that Berta would describe to her sister in a letter 3 weeks later as the expression of a man who has been given back something he did not know he had lost. Sallie wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool with a cream collar, and her hair was down for the first time Thomas had seen it, and it was the color of dark honey and fell past her shoulders, and he thought he would remember that for the rest of his life, and he was right. The Reverend said the words. They said the words back. The ring was a plain gold band that Thomas had bought at the jeweler on 3rd Street, and that fit Sally's left hand as though it had been made for it specifically. Berta had made a cake. It was the best cake anyone at Holt's had ever eaten, which was saying something, and even Thomas, who was not generally a man for sweets, ate 2 pieces. They were given Gerald Holt's best room that first night, Gerald having moved himself to the smaller one off the kitchen for the occasion, and Sallie lay awake for a long time in the dark with Thomas's arm around her, and the sounds of Abilene settling into its nighttime self outside the window. And she thought about all the things that had to happen in exactly the order they had happened for her to be precisely here, in this room, in this life, and she found that she was not sorry about any of them. Even the hard ones, because they had all been steps on the road to this. "Are you awake?" Thomas said quietly in the dark. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and pulled her a little closer, and she felt him smile against her hair. They moved to the land north of town in the spring of 1874. Thomas had purchased 40 acres through the winter, negotiating with the land office and the previous claimant, a man who had filed on it in 1870 and done nothing with it since, and by February the paperwork was settled, and by March they were building. The house went up with help from some of the men in town who had decided, without it being formally arranged, that Thomas Dawson settling down was a thing worth supporting. The blacksmith came and his 2 apprentices. Two of the drovers who had wintered in Abilene showed up on a Saturday with tools and stayed through the weekend. Even Mr. Pratt came, because his brother-in-law was a carpenter and came with him, and the frame of the house was up in 4 days. Sallie cooked for all of them, with Berta's recipes in her head and Berta's voice in her ear, and the food was good, and the work was satisfying in the way of a thing that will last after you are done building it. The house was modest. 2 main rooms downstairs, 2 upstairs, a kitchen lean-to off the back, a porch that faced south and caught the afternoon light. Thomas was particular about the porch. He spent extra time on the porch. "You think about this porch a great deal," Sallie observed one afternoon, watching him test the angle of the rail for the 3rd time. "I plan to spend a great deal of time on it," he said, without looking up from what he was doing. She laughed and went back inside to sort the supplies they had brought from town, and she thought that this was what happiness felt like when it was not performing itself for an audience, just the steady, warm reality of a life being built by 2 people who meant it. The cattle started small, 30 head of good Texas stock, that Thomas bought from a drover he knew who was selling off part of his herd before going home. He understood cattle and he understood land, and the 40 acres had the creek and the good grass, and through the summer of 1874, the small herd did well. Sallie kept the books. This was not a negotiation or an arrangement so much as a natural settling of things according to ability, and Thomas understood numbers less well than he understood land and cattle, and Sallie understood numbers the way she understood most things, which was completely. She kept a clear account of what they spent and what they made and where they were going, and she shared all of it with Thomas, going over it in the evenings at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and he listened and asked good questions and made decisions based on what she told him. And she found this, the genuine partnership of it, the actual sharing of the running of their life, to be one of the things she had not known to hope for and was most glad to have. She went back to Holt's 3 mornings a week through the 1st year, helping Gerald with his accounts. She felt she owed him that, and beyond the debt she genuinely liked the work and liked being in town, and liked the connection to the place that had given her a start when she had needed one. Gerald's hip worsened through the summer, and by the fall it was clear that he could not manage the stairs of the boarding house much longer, and there were difficult conversations about what came next. Thomas suggested, one evening at the kitchen table, that Gerald might want to consider moving into the 2nd room upstairs at the farm. He said it with the casual directness of a man proposing something sensible rather than something generous, and Sallie looked at him across the table and felt something so large and warm move through her that she had to look away for a moment and find the ceiling very interesting. "You would want that," she said. "Gerald's staying with us." "Gerald is family," Thomas said simply. She did not trust her voice for a moment. "Yes," she said when she had it back. "Yes, he is." Gerald moved out to the farm that October and spent his days in a chair on Thomas's beloved porch, and in the evenings ate dinner with them, and played cards with Thomas on the nights when the wind was too cold for the porch. And he was happy in the way of people who have found themselves in the right place at the right time in their lives without necessarily having planned for it. Their son was born in May of 1875. They had known since January, when the evidence became undeniable, and they had had the months to think about it and talk about it and make room in their minds for what was coming. Sallie had been calm and practical about the pregnancy in the way she was calm and practical about most things, though there were nights when Thomas would wake to find her sitting up and very still and looking at the window, and he would put his arm around her and she would lean into him, and eventually her breathing would even out and she would sleep again. He did not ask what she thought about in those moments because he did not need to. He simply made sure she knew he was there. Berta came out from town when the time came, because Berta had midwifing experience that she had not mentioned until it became relevant, which was typical of Berta. She took over the process with the same authority with which she took over kitchens, and Thomas was sent to the porch with Gerald and told to stay there. He stayed there for 4 hours, which were the longest 4 hours of his life, longer than any cattle drive or any fight or any night on the trail, and Gerald sat beside him and they played cards and did not discuss what either of them was thinking. The cry, when it came, was the loudest and most welcome sound Thomas had ever heard. Berta appeared at the door with an expression of satisfied triumph and said, "You have a son, a very loud son. This is a good sign." Thomas went inside and found Sallie pale and tired and incandescent with a quality that he had no word for, holding a small, red-faced person who was indeed being loud about his arrival into the world. She looked up when Thomas came in, and the look she gave him was everything. "He is very loud," Thomas said. "He takes after his father," Sallie said, which was so unexpected, given that Thomas was one of the quieter men she had ever known, that he laughed, and she laughed too, tired as she was, and the baby was alarmed by the laughing and announced his displeasure at increased volume. They named him James. James Gerald Dawson, the Gerald being a choice that made the old man on the porch cry in the dignified and restrained way of a person who was trying very hard not to cry. James was, from the beginning, a determined and opinionated person, which Berta said showed excellent character, and which Thomas said showed he had inherited his mother's stubbornness, and which Sallie said showed he had inherited his father's habit of making up his mind and not changing it without a very good reason, and all three of them were probably right. The farm grew. Thomas added to the herd through 1875 and 1876, buying carefully and selling at the right times, using Sallie's clear-eyed accounting to know exactly where they stood and what they could afford. He brought in a young man named Will who had come off the trail looking for work, and who turned out to have an instinctive way with horses that was worth considerably more than what Thomas paid him, which Thomas remedied as soon as the accounts allowed. Will was 19, from Georgia, quiet and hardworking, and he ate dinner with them most evenings and played with James on the porch on Saturday afternoons and was, Sallie told Thomas privately, going to be very good at whatever he chose to do, which meant they should treat him well enough that he chose to stay. Thomas paid Will better. Will stayed. The reputation in Abilene and around it underwent a slow revision, not dramatic, not announced. Just the gradual, incremental work of time and visibility, of Thomas Dawson being present in the community in ways that were not what the name had previously suggested. He helped dig out a neighbor's fence posts after a flood. He lent his horses to a family who had lost theirs in a fire and needed to get their harvest in. He was, when disputes arose between the smaller farmers around them, someone people came to when they wanted a fair opinion from a man who was too straightforward to tell them what they wanted to hear rather than what was true. He was still himself. He still wore the gun. He still had that quality of stillness that made rooms notice him. But it was, people found, a different kind of noticing. The room no longer held its breath when Thomas Dawson came in. It simply acknowledged him, the way you acknowledge someone you respect. Sallie watched this happen with a quiet satisfaction she kept mostly to herself. She had known it would happen because she had understood from the beginning that his reputation was a thing built by circumstances rather than character, and that character, given time and space, tends to tell the truth about itself. The summer of 1877 brought a drought, not as bad as the one Sallie remembered from Missouri, but serious enough to put several of their neighbors under real pressure. Thomas walked the land every morning and came back to report to Sallie, and they sat together at the kitchen table going over the figures with the careful attention of two people who had both known what it was like to have the ground fail and were not going to let it happen if they could help it. They made it through, not without cost. They sold off part of the herd earlier than planned and used the money carefully, and did not expand as they had intended to that year. But they made it through, and three of their neighbors made it through partly because Thomas had lent them access to the creek on his land during the worst months, and he did not make a point of it, and he did not make them feel they owed him. And Sallie loved him for it so fiercely that she had to take a moment in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table and just breathe. Their daughter was born in September of 1877, during the drought's tail end, when the air was still dry and hot, and the creek was running lower than it should have been. They named her Clara, and where James had announced himself at volume, Clara arrived quietly, and then looked around with large dark eyes that were clearly Thomas's and a focused expression that was clearly Sally's, and made her assessment of the world with the calm authority of a person who has already decided she is going to handle it. James, who was 2, viewed Clara with initial suspicion that gave way over several weeks to a proprietorial affection that manifested as standing between her and anything he perceived as threatening, including the cat, the wind, and one memorable Tuesday, a cloud. Gerald, who was now 71 and moved slowly but thought clearly and sat on the porch every afternoon regardless of temperature, held Clara on his first afternoon with her and said, "There you are," in the tone of a man who had been expecting someone. Sally stood in the doorway watching the old man with the baby and Thomas standing near the porch rail with James on his hip, the two of them watching the same thing, and she thought with full and settled clarity, this is the life. Not the life she had planned, not the life she had imagined when she had sewn $42 into the lining of her petticoat and taken a wagon to Abilene. Something better. Something that had grown up from the specific soil of the specific choices she had made, and was therefore completely and specifically hers. She stepped out onto the porch, and Thomas looked over at her, and she went to stand beside him, and he shifted James on his hip so that his free arm could come around her, and she leaned against him in the afternoon light, and the four of them, plus Gerald with Clara, occupied the porch in the way of a family that has found its shape and settled into it. Gerald Holt died peacefully in the spring of 1879, in his bed in the room upstairs that had become his, on a morning when the apple tree at the corner of the house was in bloom, and the air was sweet with it. He had been slowing for months in the gradual way of very old men, and they had had time to prepare for it, which did not make it easier but made it something other than a shock. They buried him in the Abilene cemetery, and the funeral was attended by more people than might have been expected for a man who had been living quietly on a farm for several years, because Gerald Holt had been part of this town for a long time and people remembered it. Reverend Alcott, who had married Thomas and Sally, said the words over the grave with the warmth of a man who had known Gerald personally. Sally stood at the graveside with Thomas's hand in hers and James beside her and Clara in Thomas's other arm, and she said goodbye to the man who had given her a job and a home when she had needed both, and she was grateful for him in a way that does not go away. She went back to managing the accounts of Holt's boarding house after Gerald died, working with his nephew, a reasonable young man named Davis Holt who had inherited the property, and had the good sense to recognize that he did not know how to run it, and that the woman who had been running the books for 5 years did. It gave her something that was hers, separate from the farm and the family, a piece of the world that she managed according to her own judgment, and she found that having it made her better at everything else, sharper and fuller, because she was still the person who had come to Abilene with $42 and a skill set and a willingness to use both. The farm in 1880 was 3 times the size it had been at the beginning. 120 acres, a solid herd, the horses that Will had been developing into a side business of real quality. Will was 25 now and had filed on his own land to the west of theirs, and he came for dinner on Sundays with the reliability of a person who has become family by presence and affection rather than by blood, which is the kind of family you choose, and therefore the kind that is particularly worth having. James was 5 and had decided that horses were the most important thing in the world, a conviction he expressed at considerable volume and with great frequency, and that Thomas encouraged with the patient dedication of a man who remembered being 5 and having convictions about things and understood their importance. Clara was 3 and had the vocabulary of a considerably older person, which she deployed with strategic precision in the pursuit of her interests, and which made both her parents simultaneously proud and wary. On a September evening in 1880, Thomas and Sallie sat on the porch after the children were in bed and the farm was quiet around them and the stars were out in that particular Kansas way, wide and low and comprehensive. 7 years, Sallie said. And Thomas said. Since Abilene, she said. Since the Silver Spur. He thought about it. 7 years, he said. He was quiet for a moment. Do you ever think about how different it could have been? Which direction, she asked. Either one, he said. If you had not walked into that room, if I had been somewhere else, if Patterson had sent his letter a month earlier and I had left before that evening in September. She considered all of these things with the genuine attention she gave to real questions. Yes, she said, I think about it sometimes. Mostly I think about it the way you think about a narrow miss, something that could have gone wrong and did not, and you are very glad it did not. He nodded slowly. I used to think, he said, that the things I had done, the places I had been, the name I had made for myself, those were marks that did not wash out. That they would always be the main thing people understood about me. Are they? She asked. He looked out at the dark land around them, their land, the creek invisible in the darkness but there, the horses in the paddock that Will had built, the lamplight from the kitchen window making a warm square on the porch. No, he said. They are part of it, but they are not the main thing. What is the main thing, she said. He looked at her. This, he said. You, James and Clara, Will on Sundays, the herd, the books you keep at the table every Thursday morning. The way you talk to people like they matter, which they do, but which not everyone remembers. He paused. The way you walked into a room that I was clearing and sat down in it like it was the most normal thing in the world. That is the main thing. That started all of it. Sallie looked at him and felt the full weight and warmth of everything that had come from that single, small, unremarkable decision to pull up a chair. She had not done it for him. She had done it because she was the kind of person who did not leave rooms simply because everyone else was leaving them. But it had brought her here to this porch and this man and this life, and she could not imagine any version of things that she would trade it for. Thomas, she said. Yes, I would do it again, she said. Every part of it. I would come to Abilene again and walk into that saloon and sit down in that room, and I would do it exactly the same. He reached across and took her hand, as he had taken it on the evening he asked her to marry him, with the same care and the same certainty. So would I, he said. Everything I did that led me to that room. I would do it again because it brought me here. She leaned against his shoulder and they sat together on the porch in the big, quiet Kansas night, and the stars were so thick overhead that they seemed almost loud, and somewhere in the dark the creek ran steadily over its stones, and the horses were still, and the children slept inside, and the farm was theirs, solid and real beneath them. In the spring of 1881, Sallie discovered she was expecting again. She told Thomas on a morning in March when the air still had winter in it, but the apple tree was thinking about blooming, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he set the coffee down and looked at her with that expression, the one from the church in November of 1873, the one that said he had been given something he did not know he was allowed to have. Good, he said, with great simplicity. Good, she agreed. James, who was 6 and had been lurking near the kitchen door, emerged to ask what was good and was told he was going to have another brother or sister, and received this news with the solemn gravity of a person who takes responsibility seriously. Clara, who was 3 and had very definite opinions, said she required a sister specifically, and then asked if there was more porridge. Will, when told on Sunday, shook his head and said, "You are going to need more rooms." "We are going to need more rooms," Thomas agreed. They built 2 more rooms onto the house that summer, Will and Thomas doing most of the framing with help from the same community that had built the first version 7 years before, because communities remember who shows up when they are needed, and they show up in return. The baby was born in October of 1881, a second son, healthy and determined, with Sallie's eyes and Thomas's jaw, in a manner that suggested from the first day that he was going to be someone who knew his own mind. They named him William, after no one in particular except that they both liked the name, and Will from Georgia, who had become as much family as anyone, received this information on Sunday with an expression that required him to look very hard at the middle distance for a long moment. "That is a good name," he said finally. "We thought so," Thomas said. Sallie watched them from the doorway, these two men who had found their way to her kitchen table from such different directions, and she thought about all the things that had been built in the 7 years since she had walked into a room that everyone was leaving and refused to leave it. The house and the land and the herd and the books, James and Clara and now little William, Will and his horses on the next land over, the 3 mornings a week at Holt's, the evenings on the porch, a life. A full, specific, real life, built from $42 and a piece of stubbornness, and a man who had a reputation that cleared every room he entered. She had walked into that room and pulled up a chair. He had turned and looked at her, and not quite managed to hide the thing that was already beginning. And from that single, quiet, unremarkable act of sitting down in the place where everyone else refused to sit, everything had followed. The conversations and the mornings and the porch and the ring and the church and the land and the children and the years, the steady accumulating weight of years, and every single one of them was good, not perfectly good, not without drought or difficulty or loss, but genuinely good, the way a thing is good when it has been built with care and honesty, and the specific courage of 2 people who looked at each other clearly and chose. On the last warm evening of October 1881, with the baby 3 weeks old and sleeping inside and James and Clara doing something noisy but not alarming in the backyard, and Will gone home after dinner, Thomas and Sallie sat on the porch as they always sat, side by side, his hand finding hers in the particular automatic way of people who have been finding each other's hands for years. The Kansas sky was doing its enormous evening thing, going orange and rose and finally deep blue above the flat horizon, and the stars were just beginning, the first ones bright and certain. "Quiet evening," Thomas said. "Quiet enough," Sallie said, because from the backyard came the sound of James saying something emphatic about horses that Clara was responding to with equal emphasis about something else. Thomas smiled. She felt it in the way his shoulder moved beside hers. "Are you happy?" she asked him, not because she did not know the answer, but because she found that asking it out loud, hearing it said between them, was one of the things she liked to do. He turned to look at her in the evening light, this man who had come back from every direction she had not expected, from a cattle drive and from a past and from a room full of people giving him wide berth, who had come back to her every time, who had built this life with both hands and meant every board of it. "Yes," he said, with the direct and simple honesty that was the first thing she had known about him and the thing she was most grateful for. "Completely." She turned back to the sky. His hand was warm in hers. The stars were coming out one at a time, each one steady and certain above the wide open Kansas land that was theirs. "So am I," she said. And that was the whole truth of it, complete and closed and requiring nothing added to it. The full account of 2 people who had found each other in a cleared room and had spent 7 years, and would spend all the years after, filling it with everything that mattered.